Chapter 31. After Albert and Nick left the containment unit, Nick just looked at Albert with a raised eyebrow. So, you just talked to them? Albert just laughed. At least that's the first thing we tried. Generally, it doesn't take a lot of resources and it's rather quick. Might as well try this before we invest lives and energy. Does it actually work? Nick asked. Sometimes, not always, though, Albert said. The thing is, the dreamer is a specter that feeds on mentality, which means it actually understands humans to a certain degree. It might not be able to articulate itself or learn how to speak, but it should be able to understand most of what we say. Working with a specter that feeds on mentality can be a blessing and a curse at the same time. It's a blessing since you can almost always communicate directly with them, making most things very smooth. But it can also be a curse since specters that feed on mentality are generally much more intelligent than other kinds of specters. Specters like these breach almost as much as force specters. Like, there is this one specter called the Old Lady. She is constantly in agony and pain, but she is still extremely friendly. Extractors can extract Zephix simply by talking with her. I worked with her a couple of times. She's actually very easy to work with, and it is even fun at times. She is a great conversationalist, and she always shows real care towards my problems. At least when she's not wincing in pain or complaining about the darkness or her loneliness. Nick looked sympathetic when he heard Albert's description, but the next moment Albert suddenly pointed at Nick's face. That's what she's after, pity? The Old Lady feeds on pity. On pity? Nick asked. Albert nodded. Yep, she grows more powerful by eliciting pity from people. By being nice to them and making them like you, they are far more likely to feel bad for your circumstances. That's why it's such a great time to talk to her. In like the first year of her being in the containment unit, she breached 3 times. Just for your info, that's a lot. Albert said. The first one was when one of the clerks got to know her and decided to free her. Of course, a rational human being wouldn't do something like that since they would essentially forfeit their life. But specters that feed on mentality have many subtle mental influences that can cloud your judgment. Naturally, when the Old Lady came out, she immediately killed the clerk to make sure that she didn't call anyone. After that, she tried to get out of the building, but she ran across an off-duty extractor who rapidly suppressed her and put her back in the containment unit. The second time was after she had worked and talked with the same extractor for around a month. Back then, we saw no issues, but it turned out that the more you talk to her, the closer your attachment to her. So, after working with her for over a month, the extractor essentially became her eternal servant but never showed any signs on the outside. Naturally, the extractor busted her out and the 2 of them ran away. 5 people died on their escape. It took several days to catch them, and funnily enough, a different manufacturer captured them, which meant that the Old Lady now belonged to a completely different company. The next moment, Albert laughed loudly, and then she broke out again within a week by getting a clerk to free her again, and the first manufacturer recaptured her. She hasn't broken out since then. They constantly rotate clerks and extractors, making sure that everyone only gets to talk to her once a week. Nick blinked a couple of times in surprise. He had expected that as soon as the specters were in the containment units, they would remain there, but now he had heard of a specter that had breached 3 times in a year via multiple ways. So, yeah, Albert said. Looking at Nick, they are easy to work with, but if you are careless even once, they will breach and cause you massive trouble. Nick could only nod, and the dreamer is one of those. Nick commented. Yep, Albert said. I'm pretty certain that the dreamer will agree to work with us. But if you are careless in any way, it will not hesitate to kill anyone to get out. Nick, I'm going to tell you something that my old mentor has told me. Back then, I didn't believe him, but after decades of working with specters, I can tell you that he spoke the truth. Albert put his hands on Nick's shoulders and looked him deep in the eyes. Specters cannot feel happiness, companionship, or pity, Albert said solemnly. After decades of research performed by thousands of extractors, we have found not even a single specter that can feel any of these things. Whenever you see them being in pain or being supportive, it is only an act. They want to get closer to you in some way for some sort of gain. Never believe them. Never become their friend. Never try to ally with them unless you know that working for you is more beneficial for the specter than being free. Specters will always do what is most beneficial to them. And even then, there are specters that act chaotically against their own interests. Every specter is unique and every specter needs to be treated differently. Even the blood mosquito is contained inside a special containment unit. It has worked together with Crimson Fungus City for decades, but they still don't dare to let its main body out of their sight. Kugelblitz always has at least 2 level 4 extractors or a level 5 extractor stationed near the blood mosquito, even though there has been no issue with it for decades. That's how careful you have to be of them. Do you understand? Albert asked with a serious tone. Nick took a deep breath, then he nodded with conviction. I will never feel empathy for a specter. Chapter 32. Good, Albert said with a sigh. Anyway, how about I tell you about some general things regarding working with other specters? Sounds good, Nick said. The next moment, Nick and Albert walked over to the side of the warehouse and sat in some chairs. For the next 3 hours, Albert taught Nick about general techniques for working with different specters. The more Nick heard, the gloomier he felt. Apparently, there were quite a great number of specters that simply gained power by killing people, and they only produced Zephyx that way. These kinds of specters were either amazing or almost worthless. It all depended on the moral flexibility of the manufacturer and their standing in the community. As the de facto owner of the city, Kugelblitz didn't use any unsavory methods like this, but there were a couple of manufacturers that did just that. Naturally, Kugelblitz acted like the righteous authority and tried to uncover the obvious practices of the manufacturers, but behind closed curtains, they were most likely paid off to look the other way. These other manufacturers mostly got their Zephyx from dying. People, an old person has a horrible disease that will eventually lead to their death. Hey, want to earn a ton of money for the family you're leaving behind? You just gotta die a bit earlier, and apparently there were always enough sick people, even though Albert said that the hygiene and cleanliness in the inner city was brutally high. Albert even went as far as to say that getting sick in the inner city without outside influence was nearly impossible. Albert didn't directly say it, but he suspected that the manufacturers were using shady methods to spread these diseases. But none of that had been proven yet. Naturally, Nick was not really worried about all of that, but about what he would do if he captured such a specter, killing someone just for a bit of money? That felt unacceptable to him. Sadly, the only other option to get Zephyx out of these kinds of specters was to use the bargain bin method, and when Albert mentioned the bargain bin method again, he actually chuckled in embarrassment. Under Nick's stunned gaze, Albert told him that Winter actually didn't own a shredder like the one Albert had shown him. Apparently, the cheapest method to shred parts of specters was buying a huge shredder that cost Zephyx to operate. Its price was 2 million credits, over 4 times as much as the containment unit the Dreamer was currently in. Winter didn't have the finances to purchase something like that. When Albert had said that they would just grind the Dreamer down, he had lied. So, if the Dreamer refuses, we are essentially stuck? Nick asked. Well, Albert said as he scratched his chin. Not exactly. If, for some reason, the Dreamer completely refuses to work with you, you can still sell it. The Dreamer is not a newborn specter. I think it is in the mid, if not late, hatchling stage. That's worth quite a bit. Hatchling stage? Nick asked with a raised eyebrow. Oh yeah, Albert said. That's what we extractors call the different levels of the specters. The official designation is simply level-based, level 1, 2, 3, and so on, but we extractors decided to come up with an unofficial one. Hatchlings are level 1 specters. Adolescents are level 2 specters. Adults are level 3 specters. Elders are level 4 specters. Fanatics are level 5 specters. Wow, wait, Nick said. Why are they suddenly called fanatics? Everything up to this point seemed to follow an age progression. Albert chuckled a bit, mainly because level 5 specters and stronger have this thing where some people start worshipping them due to their power and influence. For example, the parasite has a secret cult, and all the manufacturers are trying their best to get rid of it since the cult kills people and delivers corpses to the parasite. Anyway, level 6 specters are demons. We call them like this due to their extreme power and danger. Level 7 specters are fallen. Level 8 specters are called adversaries, mainly because they pose the biggest problem to humanity as a whole. Really? Nick asked. What about the level 9 specters? First of all, there are fewer level 9 specters than level 8 specters. Second, the 5 level 9 specters are already an integral part of our lives, which we can't escape from. Their existence determines the baseline of humanity as a whole. So, in a bizarre way, the level 9 specters are not humanity's enemies but the judges of humanity's prosperity. In contrast, we can still somewhat resist the level 8 specters, and the level 8 specters are doing their very best to suppress humanity. If you view humanity as a big company, you could view the level 8 specters as the chief executives and the level 9 specters as the owners. The owners very rarely come into contact with the employees, and they are rarely noticed by the employees, but when they arrive, even the chief executives have to be beyond respectful. In comparison, the chief executives are the ones making all the decisions and dictating how everyone feels. So while the level 9 specters are more powerful, they do whatever they want, which means, in a way, they are not the collective enemy of humanity. It's a bit weird to explain. It's like one is a huge monster, and the other is a natural catastrophe. You can't really view a natural catastrophe as an enemy or fight it, you know? Nick scratched his chin. Oh, by the way, what are level 9 specters called? Eternal, Albert answered. They are just called Eternals. Nick nodded. Is there something similar for extractors? Albert nodded. Level 1 extractors are called newbies. Level 2 are called Johns. John? Nick asked with a raised eyebrow. Albert laughed. Yes, John. Level 2 extractors are the most numerous and most average. They used to be called John Doe, but it was shortened to just Johns. The most common and generic extractors get the most common and generic name. Johns. Nick repeated. You're serious? I'm absolutely serious, Albert said with a suppressed chuckle. If everything works out, you will also become a John one day. Nick just blinked once. Chapter 33. After a while, Nick just sighed. It seemed like extractors were quite casual. What about level 3 extractors? Nick asked. Veterans, Albert answered. They already worked a lot with specters, which is why they are called veterans. Level 4 extractors are called experts. I'm an expert, Albert said with a smile. Level 5 extractors are called specialists. Crimson Fungus City has fewer than 30 of those. Level 6 extractors are called heroes. Heroes? Nick asked. Yep, because if there is something threatening the city, they are the ones saving us, and without them, this city wouldn't even exist, Albert explained. Without the heroes, all of us wouldn't be alive right now. Heroes represent the strongest existences we can get into contact with. Nick raised an eyebrow. But what about the level 7 and level 8 extractors? They're special, Albert said. Normal cities only have extractors up to level 6. Level 7 extractors count as legends, and they have dedicated their lives to helping humanity against the specters. Level 7 extractors are the ones keeping humanity safe from the fallen, the level 7 specters. There are less than 100 level 7 extractors. They are called the protectors. And as for level 8 extractors, Albert said before trailing off. Then, he released a deep sigh. We are forever stuck with only having 7 of them. We will never be able to have more than 7. Why? Nick asked with furrowed brows. The Maw, Albert answered. The Maw just loves pitting similarly powerful extractors against each other, and it always takes 8. So, if we ever get an 8th level 8 extractor, the Maw will take all of them. In the end, only one will come out. Meanwhile, there are over 40 level 8 specters. Nick became silent when he heard that 7 versus over 40. The level 8 extractors were fighting a hopeless battle. And what are they called? Nick asked. Well, for all intents and purposes, they should be called heroes, but since normal people keep referring to level 6 extractors as heroes, we had to choose a different name. So, we decided to name them after what they are doing. They are unable to injure our enemy, but at least they are able to shield us from the worst our enemy can throw at us. That's why we call them shields. Nick remained silent for a while. He could feel how noble and selfless the 7 shields were. Without them, the adversaries, the level 8 specters, would have already run rampant. Is there a name for a potential level 9 extractor? Nick asked. Albert remained silent for a while. Well, a level 9 extractor would be able to resist the Eternals, and they would have the power to actually win against the specters as a whole. Someone like that could only be called our savior. Nick just nodded without saying anything. Level 7 and level 8 extractors seemed to be very different from all the other extractors. According to what Albert had said, the weaker extractors were still working for the different cities and effectively running them, but level 7 and level 8 extractors were focusing on protecting humanity from the specters. However, Nick wasn't He knew exactly that it wasn't possible that every single level 7 extractor was some kind of selfless saint who dedicated their life to fighting for humanity. This meant that there were either more level 7 extractors or every level 7 extractor was forced to fight for humanity. Nick wished that the second option was true, but he guessed that the first one was more likely to be true. The truly powerful people have a chance at actually changing the world for the better. Someone that has the power to change something should have a duty to change things. So many people want to change the world for the better but lack the power. Because of that, I believe that when you have the power, you have a duty to make the world a better place. I wouldn't be opposed to forcing the strong humans to fight for humanity. They don't need to sacrifice their lives, but they need to put in a real effort. Nick sighed. However, all of that doesn't matter. I am weak, and my opinion and actions have nearly no effect on the world as a whole. For now, I should focus on what's in front of me. Should we go back to the dreamer? Nick asked. Oh, has it been 3 hours already? Albert asked. Nick nodded. All right, then go in. Nick blinked a couple of times in surprise. You're not coming with me? Nope, Albert said. This is your specter. I showed you how to work with it and helped you a bit, but that was it. You're the chief Zephix extractor. You're the one in charge of all specters and extractors. It is your duty to manage the facility. If you can't keep the specters in check, you won't be able to get any Zephix from them, at which point you have to sell them, Albert explained. Nick took a deep breath. I understand. Naturally, Nick knew that he was the one in charge, but it was still difficult to come to terms with it. Nick had never led anyone, and he was still only 16 years old. Having the fate of an entire corporation hanging on his actions alone made his chest feel tight and his shoulders heavy. Usually, one could almost always ask someone more powerful or more experienced. A child could ask an adult about what to do. An employee could ask their supervisor, a supervisor could ask a manager, a soldier could ask an officer, and Nick? He was the one in charge. Well, technically, Winter was in charge, but Winter didn't have much to do with the specters themselves. I guess I have to learn to take control and to lead people, Nick thought with a sigh. It just feels so weird. I'm not entirely sure what I should do. Nick took a deep breath and stood up. Well, I won't get an answer by just thinking about it. Then he walked towards the containment unit of the Dreamer. Chapter 34. Nick operated the console and opened the entrance for the employees. The light in the containment unit sprang on, and Nick immediately saw the Dreamer. After opening the door, the Dreamer was standing near one of the walls. Nick wasn't sure if he preferred this position over the one where the Dreamer just lay in the corner. Nick stepped into the containment unit with confidence, and the door closed behind him. Nick looked at the Dreamer looked at Nick. Silence. Nick's heart began to race. At this moment, Nick's ability obviously didn't work, and the employee door took a couple of seconds to open. This meant that if the Dreamer decided to attack, Nick would have to fight it for a couple of seconds before Albert could get in or Nick out. I can't rely on Albert, Nick thought as he looked at the Dreamer with narrowed eyes. Albert is only here for today. Even if he saves me now, he won't be able to save me tomorrow. Remember, Albert said that specters always do what's most beneficial to them. The Dreamer is not powerful enough to escape from the containment unit. Even if it kills me, it won't be able to get out, and I'm certain it knows that. Because of that, attacking me would only antagonize the manufacturer it now belongs to, reducing our trust in it and making its life more difficult. If I were in its position, I would want to play the good boy until I get enough Zephix to become a level 2 Spectre and adolescent before breaking out of the containment unit. The Dreamer and Nick were still silently looking at each other. The Dreamer had no expression whatsoever, and Nick had no idea what it was thinking or feeling right now. It just kept staring at him like a statue. I presume you are willing to work with us. Nick said, I think you would have attacked me if you didn't agree. Smart decision. The Dreamer just kept looking at Nick. We both know my power, and we both know that you are superior to me in every way as long as you can see me. However, we also know that I can still avoid your attacks for a while, and compared to before, we are now on my home turf. I only need to survive until the door is open. The Dreamer didn't do anything. Naturally, the Dreamer's lack of reaction increased Nick's heart rate. It was just too creepy to look at something that was alive but deliberately acted like it was not. Of course, you still have a genuine chance to kill me. The Dreamer didn't do anything, but you have also noticed the alarms earlier, and I'm pretty sure you already figured out when the alarm gets triggered. If you decide to attack me, I will know before you actually attack. The Dreamer just kept staring emotionlessly and silently. Ding. 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 The next moment, the alarm rang, and Nick immediately put his hand on the console of the door behind him. However, he didn't press it. Instead, he only glared at the Dreamer. Surprisingly, the Dreamer just kept standing there. It was almost like it hadn't done anything. You get it now? Nick asked. Naturally, the Dreamer had tested out the alarm. It wanted to know if the past activations had just been coincidences or not, and it didn't like what it saw. Whenever it was thinking about launching an attack, the alarm rang. The alarm activated so fast that the Dreamer wasn't even sure whether or not it had actually wanted to attack. It felt very bizarre. It was almost like the alarm could tell the future. Okay, Nick said as he walked away from the door. Then he slowly walked towards the dreamer. Since the dreamer currently stood on the ground, it seemed almost harmless. After all, it was just a barely 50-centimeter tall owl. Sure, it was quite a big bird, but that was it. However, Nick knew how powerful the dreamer actually was. Step by step, Nick closed in on the dreamer. Eventually, only a single meter separated them. The entire time, the two of them only looked into each other's eyes. Silence. The dreamer didn't attack. Naturally, Nick's heart rate was quite elevated at this moment, and adrenaline was coursing through his body. However, he also knew that he had to get through this. If he didn't manage to work with the dreamer, he couldn't call himself the chief Zephix extractor. He had to be able to work with the most powerful specters of the company. Good, Nick said, then let's start working. The next moment, Nick turned around and walked to one of the walls. Then he sat down with his back to the wall. You gain power by giving people nightmares, right? The dreamer didn't answer. When you gain power, you give off the stuff we want. Albert, Nick shouted as he looked towards one of the walls. Set the conversion rate to 90 for now. Some seconds passed. Done. Albert's voice came from one of the speakers in the corner. Nick nodded and looked back at the dreamer. For now, we will take 90, and you get to keep 10. Naturally, that is very much in our favor, but for now, that's your only option. If you prove to be trustworthy, we will allow you to retain more Zephix. After all, if you manage to become an adolescent, we will also get more Zephix. You growing stronger is also in our interest. But for now, we have to be careful of you. The next moment, Nick took a deep breath. I will try to fall asleep in here, and you do your thing. However, keep in mind that I am currently the only person willing to work with you using this method. If I accidentally die, we will only have the bargain bin method left, and we might not trust you anymore, which means you stay a hatchling forever. Don't do anything stupid. And then Nick closed his eyes. Chapter 35. Nick's eyes remained closed. On the inside, Nick's heart was still racing, and he felt very nervous, but on the outside, he seemed calm. He wanted to open his eyes several times, but he forced them closed. Time passed. Clink. Nick's eyes slowly opened. Just now. The dreamer took a step forward, its black eyes fully focused on Nick's eyes. It was still as expressionless as earlier. Nick covertly took a very deep breath and closed his eyes. Clink. Nick's eyes remained closed. Clink, clink, clink. 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 Clink, clink. The last two steps had come within a short moment from Nick's right side. He knew that the dreamer was currently standing directly beside him. Nick slowly opened his eyes and turned his head to the side. Black eyes. Nick's body shuddered as his vision was almost completely taken up by two black eyes. While sitting, Nick could almost see eye to eye with the dreamer, and right now, the dreamer's eyes were just 20 centimeters away from Nick's eyes. If the dreamer just used its beak to peck him, Nick would probably lose one eye before he could react. The more Nick looked into those eyes, the more he felt like they were empty. Usually, when someone got more familiar with something, they managed to see subtle signs that told them more about the thing they were familiar with. Not here. The more Nick learned about the dreamer, the more he felt like he was just looking into an emotionless ghost or something similar. There was no disregard, hunger, rage, hatred, or whatever in its eyes. It was almost like it wasn't even conscious. It was like it was just a dead statue, but it wasn't, and that was why Nick felt so nervous right now. It felt wrong. Nick felt like the dreamer wasn't supposed to exist. It was not dead. But it didn't act like it was alive. Nevertheless, Nick took a deep breath and closed his eyes again. Time passed, minutes passed. The dreamer had not moved ever since it had stepped beside Nick. After 30 minutes had passed, Nick wasn't even sure whether or not the dreamer was actually beside him. Usually, one could feel when someone was right beside them. Breathing, slight movements, the change in the wind, the smell, some noise. None of that was here. The dreamer didn't breathe, smell, or move. And since there was also no wind in here, it also couldn't block it. It was like Nick was alone. Usually, Nick would prefer this feeling. After all, most people wanted to sleep alone, but the fact that he knew that the dreamer, a specter, was right beside him made it impossible for him to calm down. Nevertheless, Nick did his best to calm down. However, Nick knew that this state of affairs would continue for a long time. How am I supposed to fall asleep with that thing right beside me? It was difficult enough to sleep under normal circumstances, but it was even more difficult when something you didn't trust was looking right at you. But Nick tried. Nick, came the quiet voice of Albert from one of the speakers. Yes. Nick asked quietly, the prefix levels are slowly rising, but my scanner says that they are not in preparation for an attack. You should inform the next person of this occurrence lest they make a miscall and rush in. Tell me if you feel a change. Nick nodded slowly. I will. Nick hadn't opened his eyes yet. Some moments later, Nick's mind was getting woozy. Images from what happened that day weaved in and out of his consciousness, and Nick felt like he was losing focus. The next moment, Nick yawned deeply. He was about to fall asleep. That was when Nick noticed it. He had just expected that he would be sitting here for hours, but now he felt very tired and was about to fall asleep. I am getting very tired and I think I will fall asleep soon, Albert, Nick said. I think the dreamer is helping me fall asleep. Noted, Albert said, just fall asleep. I'm here if anything happens. If you are still asleep after 8 hours, I will come in and wake you up. Nick yawned deeply again. Sounds great. Good night, Nick said in a sleepy voice. Outside, Albert was looking at the console with a complex expression. Yes, good night, he answered awkwardly. Albert just threw a glance out of the window as if to confirm whether or not it was night. Why am I even looking outside? I can only see the sun through the upper windows and the sun isn't related to the time of day, Albert thought as he shook his head. Inside the containment unit, Nick felt his mind melt into different scenes. Today had been a very busy day. After waking up in the early morning, Nick and Winter had prepared themselves for their excursion. At noon, Nick had jumped into the sewers and he had continually been swimming in them for over 10 hours. Then, Nick had been tortured by the nightmare, which had significantly drained his mind. After that, Nick had fought the dreamer in a life-and-death battle before finally subduing it, and then they even needed to walk several kilometers into the actual outer city. At which point they had a short scuffle with some guards. At least Nick had been able to take a short nap in the healing bath, but after that he had spent another 3 hours in the company itself. The fact that he had still been able to pay attention to Albert's teachings after that much had happened was surprising, and now Nick had been over half an hour in the presence of the dreamer while trying not to open his eyes. It was so much shit had happened today, but now Nick felt calm. He could finally let go and get a good night's sleep. At this moment, for whatever reason, Nick had completely forgotten the presence of the dreamer right beside him. Some seconds later, Nick's back and legs became weak and his body slumped. The dreamer kept looking at the sleeping Nick on the outside. Albert looked at the different graphs on the console and he took a deep breath when one of the graphs showed a curve traveling upward. This was the graph for Zephix's production at this moment. The dreamer was producing Zephix. Nick was successfully working with it. Chapter 36. I'm sorry. Please. I won't do it again. Nick shouted in absolute terror as he did his best to beg for his life on his broken legs. Bang. The next moment, Nick's face was kicked in by a metallic boot. Pless, ahm sorry, Nick cried through his crushed face. You are the reason why young Master Winter is dead, one of the 3 armored people in front of him spoke. Your carelessness is why the Lord is now grieving. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, Nick said through his crushed teeth. Bang. The metallic boot crushed Nick's forearm and Nick began to scream even more. Nick tried to get his crushed forearm out from under the boot, which was grinding Nick's forearm into a crunchy paste of meat and bone. You think saying sorry will help you? The person spoke calmly and coldly through his black gas mask, but don't worry, you won't die today. The black gas mask was coming closer to Nick's face. You will stay alive for as long as the Lord commands it. He has many ways to keep you alive when your body begs to die. No. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Please. Nick just kept shouting garbled words through the crushed mess that had once been his face. Take him away, the man said as he turned around to walk away. No. No. Nick just kept shouting as the 2 other people grabbed him. The next moment, Nick found himself impaled onto a wooden cross with 3 spikes. 2 were going through Nick's wrists, and 1 was going through both his legs. Interesting, isn't it? The disfigured and small man in front of Nick said with a loud but awkward chuckle, this is the most popular and famous torture method from the old world. The torturer said, we found many depictions of this torture method in the ruins. You should consider yourself lucky. After all, not everyone gets to reenact such a monumental piece of history with their own body. After deciding for a while, the disfigured man took hold of a thin and small knife. Nick didn't show any reactions. All right, you know how this goes, just don't move too much, okay? The man shouted with an awkward laugh. The next moment, the torturer stepped on a small ladder behind the cross and put the knife on the underside of Nick's right big toe, and then he cut into it. The knife methodically moved towards the center of Nick's foot. While this was happening, Nick's body was shuddering. But he wasn't saying anything. All right, that's the first one. Keep holding still. If you do a good job, you get a couple of days of peace in the drowning cage. Then, the torturer slowly cut down from the second toe, then the third, and so on. Eventually, all the cuts met in the middle of the underside of Nick's feet. Now, let's see the next moment. The torturer grabbed both sides of one of the cuts and pulled to the side, RIP. After ripping them to the side a bit, the torturer took hold of the knife again while the other hand kept Nick's skin off from his flesh. The next moment, the torturer slowly and carefully cut the connective tissue between Nick's skin and his flesh. Nick gritted his teeth, but they had already been filed into thin needles that weren't aligned with each other, essentially forcing them to dig into the opposite gums when he closed his mouth. Nevertheless, this was all Nick could do. Now look at this beautiful toe, the torturer said as the skin of Nick's big toe lay on top of Nick's toe like wrapping paper for a present. All right, let's do the second one. As Nick felt a sharp and intense pain come from his second toe, he just opened his eyes lifelessly. What greeted Nick was the sight of a human skin hanging from the ceiling a couple of meters in front of him. Besides that piece of skin were several more. There were over 10 sets of skins, all having different levels of quality. They had all belonged to Nick at one point. He had gone through this torture many times before. Whenever the torturer wanted another set, he would pull out Nick's skin and then bathe him in healing liquid. After that, Nick would get to relax in a cage that was almost completely underwater. Only by pursing his lips on the top could Nick get a bit of air, and only when the water was calm, and worst of all, they had cut out Nick's tongue and vocal cords to stop him from saying the sentence. This was his life. This was what his life would become. It was hopeless. It was eternal. The torture was never-ending. Nick just closed his eyes again. Nick felt the reality shake. Hey, Nick. The next moment, Nick's mind began to swim and he felt himself getting transported somewhere else. Nick opened his eyes and he saw a white light shining onto him. Huh. Nick said in confusion. Nick's left arm moved upward and touched his head as he grimaced a bit. Everything all right? Albert asked. Yeah, I think so, Nick said as he slowly righted himself. I feel a bit confused and groggy. Also, I think I had a really bad dream, but I don't really remember. It's all foggy. Right? Nick said louder as he looked around the white room. He spotted the dreamer standing in one of the corners, looking at him. Then, Nick to his left, Albert was standing left of him. Are 8 hours already up? Nick asked in a bit of confusion. Yep, Albert said. You slept very calmly. No one would think that you were going through a nightmare. You did go through one, right? Nick's brows furrowed. I think so. I feel all exhausted and I feel like I cried and went through hell. But I can't remember. I know that something horrible has happened, but I just don't know what exactly. It's a strange feeling. Albert nodded. Well, whatever you went through worked. You produced a lot of Zephyx. Want to see? Nick slowly stood up and shook his head again. He was still tired. Yeah, sure. Chapter 37. Nick threw another glance at the dreamer, which was still looking at him with its emotionless eyes. Nick had no idea what the dreamer was feeling or thinking about. It was like a blank canvas. Then, Nick left the containment unit and followed Albert to the console. Albert pointed at a small monitor to the side of the console and slapped Nick's shoulders quite roughly. You see in this, he shouted with excitement. Nick looked at the small monitor and saw the gauge of a tank. This was the Zephyx tank of the Dreamer's containment unit. The gauge had a maximum volume of 50, and right now it was at a bit over 5. You managed to get 5 grams of Zephyx on your first time. That's amazing. Albert shouted with a laugh. Nick just looked at the gauge with confusion since he didn't know how much 5 grams of Zephyx was, but Albert's enthusiasm also made him a bit excited. How much is 5 grams of Zephyx? Nick asked. About 5,000 credits, Albert said with a smirk. Nick's eyes widened. How much? 5,000 credits? But the full-body healing bath only cost 4,800 credits, Nick said in a dumbfounded manner. Nick hadn't had issues with coming up with the taxes each month, but he had never owned more than 500 credits at a time. 500 credits had essentially counted as his life savings, and now he had made 5,000 just by sleeping a bit? If he just kept sleeping in there every single day, wouldn't he make over 100,000 credits per month? How much of that will I get? Nick asked. Depends on winter, Albert said. You have to remember that these 5,000 credits represent an entire day of operations for your company. 5,000 credits are quite a bit, but it's not that much if you want to run a small company. For example, just keeping the lights on in the containment unit for that long cost you around 650 credits. Nick's eyes widened. 650 credits for the lights? That's over 10. Albert nodded. That's why this containment unit is so cheap. Almost all other containment units use shafts of mirrors to get natural light in them. Over a long period of time, the more expensive containment units are more cost-effective. Of course, after paying for the lights, you also have to pay the rent of the warehouse. Wait, rent? Nick asked in shock. I thought this warehouse belonged to us. Albert just laughed. Nick, do you have any idea how expensive such a big house is outside the dregs? If you want to buy the warehouse, you probably need more than 300,000 credits. Nick took a deep breath. Lighten up, Albert said. Compared to the light, the rent shouldn't be that bad. Based on the location and size, I would guess that winter pays somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 credits per month. That's less than 100 credits per day. It really isn't that bad, Nick thought. then you have to pay Peter. After all, he's an employee. Based on his profile, he probably also earns about 2,000 to 3,000 credits per month. That's also a bit less than 100 credits per day. After that, we need to consider expansion costs. Albert said, when you run a company, you keep the company's assets and finances separate from your personal ones, and since you guys want to expand at some point, you will probably save about 50 of the profit. The remainder will probably be split between the two of you. All in all, I expect that you get around 1,000 credits per day of work for yourself, Albert explained. Nick slowly nodded. 1,000 credits per day wasn't as much as 5,000 credits per day, but it was still an insane amount to Nick. 1,000 credits per day, Nick repeated with a distracted voice. Then, Nick remembered something. What about the Dreamer? Can it actually produce Zephyx once a day? Albert snorted. Nick, the Dreamer is a specter that feeds on mentality. Compared to a specter that feeds on something physical, it doesn't need to digest its food. On top of that, specters don't need to sleep, breathe, or eat. The Dreamer can probably go forever. Then Albert pointed at Nick, but you can't. Nick furrowed his brows. Why not? I just slept for 8 hours, but I feel like I can continue sleeping. You shouldn't underestimate my ability to sleep. If I really want to, I can sleep a long time. Albert slowly shook his head. That's the issue. You just slept for 8 hours, but you feel like you can immediately continue sleeping. That doesn't sound very rested to me. Are you tired right now? Do you feel like you've had a good night's sleep? Nick looked at the ground with a thoughtful expression. His mind felt strained. It was almost like he had been awake for over 24 hours. Even more, Nick still felt like it was the same day he had entered the sewers, which felt strange. It's strange, Nick said. I feel like I haven't slept. Albert nodded. That's what I thought. Nick, sleeping is a natural process where the body cleans and organizes the mind while your body enters a resting state. The Dreamer is changing that process by giving you nightmares, so instead of your mind reorganizing, it has to experience more things and store more memories. This means that your mind is not essentially sleeping. Nick furrowed his brows with a frown. So, I have to sleep again? He asked as he scratched the back of his head. Albert nodded. Yep, you have to actually go to sleep. Working with the Dreamer is just that. Work. It is not rest nor sleep. Nick could only sigh and nod. He could tell that Albert was right, and he accepted his explanation. At that moment, the door of the warehouse suddenly opened and Nick looked over. The next moment, he saw Winter standing beside Peter. Oh yeah, Albert said. Like you just remembered something. I sent Peter to get Winter about an hour ago or something like that. I thought he would want to know how things went. The distant Winter turned to Peter, nodded, and told him something. Peter performed a short and polite bow and walked away from the warehouse. The next moment, Winter walked into the warehouse and the door ominously closed behind him. Winter walked over and stopped in front of Albert and Nick. You're not wearing your uniform? Winter asked Nick. Chapter 38. Nick's eyes widened, right? I totally forgot. Then, Nick went over to the side of the warehouse. He had dumped his uniform in this place earlier. After all, it would be a bit awkward to enter the Dreamer's containment unit with a stack of clothing in his hands. I'll go put it on. Nick shouted as he ran behind the containment unit. Winter just shook his head with a sigh. He's so different, Winter said. To whom? Albert asked. The people in the inner city, Winter answered. Albert chuckled a bit. Yes, but he's not that much different to how people in the dregs are. Well, he's a bit more altruistic than the average person. But I've seen my fair share of interesting events while teaching him in the dregs. Winter didn't seem convinced as he continued looking at the containment unit. Are you sure? I thought, since resources are so scarce, the people in the dregs are even more greedy and possessive than the people in the inner city, Winter said. Albert hummed a bit. I wouldn't say so. Winter raised an eyebrow as he looked at Albert. I think they are more open with their desires than the people of the inner city. It has a much greater impact when a friendly and nice person suddenly turns out to be a greedy asshole than when an asshole suddenly turns into a greedy asshole. Winter blinked a couple of times. Strange metaphor, he stated. I mean, I think about the same number of people are selfish assholes in the inner city than in the dregs, but the selfish assholes that do exist are much easier to see in the dregs, making it seem like there are more. Makes sense, Winter answered. However, there are also a lot of people like Nick, Albert added. In what way? People that are unhappy with the world but lack the power to change it, Albert said. Someone that still manages to retain humanity and empathy in a place where having these things is a luxury. There is no lack of bad people in this world, but in severe poverty, even the good people are forced to do bad things. Naturally, people with a lot of empathy can still see when someone doesn't want to hurt someone else but is forced to in order to survive. That's a tragedy in and of itself. If things were different, these people wouldn't be forced into a dark path, and many victims would have never become victims. Nick has such a belief, Albert said. I know for a fact that he has already killed at least one person on purpose, but I also know that it will be very difficult for him to hurt someone who tries to hurt him but doesn't actually want to hurt him. If you get what I mean. Winter raised an eyebrow in surprise. Nick has killed someone? He asked. Nick seemed like a very nice and idealistic teenager to him. Winter couldn't connect this nice teenager to a murder. Albert nodded. Nick managed to survive on his own in the dregs for 6 years, and he even managed to build quite an impressive and athletic body. If you want such a body, you can't afford to lose 2 liters of blood per month. 80 of the people in the dregs can't pay their taxes every month. Even more, Nick managed to make the gangs his enemies, which would make it even more difficult for him to earn money. And yet, he always managed to do it. Even more, you can't overlook his enmity with the gangs. The gangs are organized and powerful. Killing a single man is not difficult at all for them. But for some reason, they are not willing to kill Nick even though they don't like him. That can only mean that it isn't worth the price in their eyes, which means that they are certain that they will lose people to him, which, in turn, means they are certain that he can and will kill them. If the local rulers of the dregs are sure that Nick has killed someone, I am inclined to believe them. Winter just looked at the containment unit with a concerned expression. Silence. Eventually, Winter just sighed. Peta said that you have something important to report, he said, changing the subject. Albert grinned and took out a green flask, which he moved from side to side for a bit. Winter just looked at the flask, not understanding what Albert was trying to convey. You don't get it? Albert asked. Winter looked at the bottle for a couple more seconds. Sorry, no, I don't, Winter said. Albert just chuckled a bit. I used that on the Dreamer about 11 hours ago. At that moment, Winter's eyes shot open in shock. I'm not paying for that. He immediately said, I know, Albert said. Winter still looked warily at Albert. Why would you use a grade 4 healing potion on a level 1 specter? Winter asked. I didn't use the entire thing, Albert said as he rubbed the back of his head. I only used a drop. Also, because I got bored and I wanted to teach Nick by actually showing him what to do instead of just telling him. Winter's eyebrows rose in positive surprise. Oh? So, can we earn money with the Dreamer now? Albert just grinned and pointed at the gauge of the Zephix tank. Winter looked at the gauge, and when he saw it, his eyes widened. 5 grams. He shouted, Yep, 5 whole grams, Albert said with a laugh. Winter looked at the containment unit with wonder. And I basically had nothing to do with it, Albert said before pointing at the edge of the containment unit. It was all him. Winter followed Albert's finger and looked over, and the next moment Nick walked around the corner of the containment unit. When Winter saw, he was taken aback by Nick's appearance. Meanwhile, Albert just smiled. Now, he looks just like a real extractor. Chapter 39. Nick wore a red and black shirt with several pockets, and his pants were form-fitting and black. All in all, Nick looked quite sharp and competent. It was quite difficult to connect the current Nick to a person from the dregs. He basically looked like all the other Zephix extractors, which was a good thing since almost all Zephix extractors exhibited this aura of authority, status, and power. The only thing pulling down was his chaotic haircut. You look great. Albert shouted with a thumbs up. Winter also nodded. Please keep the uniform clean and wear it when you have to work. Every Zephix extractor only gets 1 set. How am I supposed to keep it clean? Nick asked as he walked closer. You wash it, Albert said, with water. Nick asked. Meanwhile, Winter raised an eyebrow in confusion. Yes, with water, Albert said, but water is for drinking. Why would I waste a good barrel of water just to keep my clothing clean? Nick asked like he had just heard the dumbest thing. Nick, Albert said with a deadpan voice, you earned something like 1,000 credits just now. A barrel of water doesn't even cost you 5 credits, and you can even wash your clothes several times with one. Albert, Winter said before Nick could answer. Why wash it with water? I thought extractor uniforms are made to be washed with cleanser. The guy doesn't even want to waste water, Albert said, pointing at Nick with his thumb. You want to try to convince him to use something 100 times as expensive as water to wash his clothes? Also, it doesn't really matter when you get a cleansing shower in here, the problem will resolve itself anyway. I guess it makes sense, Winter said. What's a cleanser and a cleansing shower? Nick asked. The blue bath before you take the green bath, Winter answered. That's filled with cleanser, it's the blue liquid. A cleansing shower is a small room that pours cleanser all over you. Every manufacturer has a couple of those since some specters can become stronger by coming into contact with matter from the outside. Since cleanser isn't very expensive for manufacturers due to their insane profits, they just force everyone that enters or exits a containment unit to take a cleansing shower beforehand as a precaution. We won't be any different since it's a negligible expense for an increase in security. Nick nodded a couple of times. Oh, okay, sounds fancy. Anyway, Winter said as he walked closer to Nick with a smile, I just saw the 5 grams of Zephyx you produced, that's a lot. Nick smiled brightly when he heard that. Are we able to remain in operation indefinitely now? Winter furrowed his brows as he evaluated some things. Kinda. Nick asked, well, if we were to remain on this level, we could continue indefinitely, but that's not our goal, is it? Nick raised his eyebrows in unsure concern. I guess not. No, it isn't, Winter said with a firm tone. The bare minimum we want to achieve is to earn 50 to 100 million credits so that I can buy a small part of Kugelblitz. If we were to operate in this manner indefinitely, that would take decades. We need more profit. We need to optimize Zephyx production with the Dreamer and expand our scope of operations. Catching specters, containing specters, employing people, paying rent, buying containment units, and so on all costs money. And one Dreamer just isn't enough to pay for all of this. Nick raised an eyebrow in concern. He understood that Winter wanted to become an heir to his family, but he also couldn't understand why someone would need that much money. They were already earning 1,000 credits per day. Nick could literally do everything he wanted with that much money. Okay, we can do that, Nick said after a bit. Good, Winter answered with a smile. Now you've had a long day behind you, and I think you deserve a break. Naturally, I want to produce more money with the Dreamer, but I think it's important that you get a couple of days to yourself. Why don't you take the next 3 days off to recover? Maybe go look around for some houses in the outer city? Maybe meet some friends? Maybe go buy something? In short, relax, Winter said, putting his hand on Nick's shoulder. The next moment, Winter took out a small card and pushed it into Nick's hands. Nick looked at the card and noticed that it looked very similar to the card that the guard had used to pay for Nick's bath. It's yours, Winter said. Nick looked at the card with wonder. If you want to buy something, just hand it to the seller, but be careful which shops you frequent. Some of the sleazier shops might decide to exchange your card for a counterfeit. Nick just continued looking at the card. How much is it worth? 10,000 credits. See it as a hiring bonus, Winter said. Nick's eyes shot open. 10,000 credits. What was he supposed to do with that much money? Nick reflexively tried to hand the card back to Winter, but Winter just shoved it back into Nick's hands. It's yours, Nick, Winter said. You're my chief Zephyx extractor, and today, you made 5,000 credits for the company. Within 2 weeks, my and your personal wealth will increase by another 10,000 credits as long as you keep working diligently. Nick looked with uncertainty at Winter and then looked at his card. Yes, what Winter said made a lot of sense, but Nick still felt strange about just accepting 10,000 credits. Logically, he knew that he would earn the company much more, but emotionally, he felt like he didn't deserve that much money. Well, it seems like everything's going well here, Albert said from behind them. I think it's time for me to leave. Winter turned to Albert and gave him a respectful handshake. Thank you again for your help today. No problem, Albert said. Then Albert turned to Nick. See you at some point, Nick. Nick was taken out of his thoughts and looked at Albert. Oh yeah. Thanks again, Albert. Without you, this wouldn't have been as easy. I know, Albert said with a smile. See ya. Then Albert walked out of the warehouse. A couple minutes later, Nick also left the warehouse. Winter had essentially thrown him out of the warehouse, telling him that he should relax for the next 3 days. Nick just absent-mindedly walked away from the warehouse. He just kept looking at his card. Chapter 40. Nick just aimlessly walked back to the dregs with a disoriented expression. 10,000 credits, 3 days of nothing to do. Nick had achieved his dream. He had become a Zephyx extractor. He was earning a lot of money. He didn't need to fear for his life anymore. Well, outside of being in the Dreamer's containment unit, and yet, there was a certain emptiness in Nick's chest. It was almost like all of this wasn't real. Literally just 2 days ago, Nick had been poor and had spent all of his life in the dregs. Now, Nick was wearing nice clothes and he had even taken a fancy bath. Even more, he was rich eventually. Nick just stopped walking by now. He had already reached the dregs again, and he had stopped in the middle of a random road. Nick just looked around the area. He saw a couple of people, but they all avoided him. None of them dared to look at him, and the few that had to travel past him either waited for him to leave or passed him with a wide berth. There was fear and nervousness in their faces. Nick felt the distance between him and the people around him widen. In a way, Nick felt like he had been thrown out of his home. Just a couple days ago, no one had batted an eye when he had been walking through the dregs, but now everyone was looking at him from a distance with fear. I guess this is what happens, he thought with a sigh. I look like a Zephyx extractor now, and all Zephyx extractors get such looks. What am I saying? I don't look like a Zephyx extractor, I am a Zephyx extractor. This is what I have always dreamed of. Nick looked around the area with newfound motivation, but the more he looked at the people, the more isolated he felt. Eventually, Nick sighed again before continuing to walk. After a couple of minutes, Nick reached his goal. In front of Nick was a sizable house made of rusty metal, but compared to most houses, this one was quite a lot bigger. It was almost a mansion. It was Nick's current home. Nick opened the door and walked inside. The house smelled just like the dregs outside. But Nick didn't mind. He was used to the smell of rust, shit, piss, and toxic waste. Nick, came the voice of a young boy from upstairs. A boy, about 11 years old, walked down the steps, but as soon as he saw the person standing at the entrance of the house, the boy stopped in shock. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" the boy asked with a fearful voice. "It's me, Horua," Nick said. "And Nick?" "Horua," the boy asked in shock. Horua was the actual owner of the big house. Horua was the only child of a quite rich man in the dregs, which meant that he was earning about as much as the average person in the outer city. He had only needed to save enough money to move out of the dregs, but before he could do so, he vanished. After some weeks, the gang started to covet the man's old house and closed in on it. Naturally, Horua couldn't resist them, but then Nick intervened, and he defended Horua. However, while Nick was a nice person, he was also a practical one. To say that Nick only helped the little boy out of the goodness of his heart would be a lie. Nick saw Horua's troubles as a good way to earn some money without having to commit horrible acts. In exchange for a place to live and his tax money, Nick made sure that no one dared to take anything from the house or hurt Horua for the past months. "Nick had been living here? Is that really you?" Horua asked. Nick nodded. "Yep," he said as a smile appeared on his face. "I'm officially a Zephyx extractor now." "Cool, huh?" Horua looked with shock at Nick as he slowly walked closer. For several seconds, Horua just looked at the uniform like it was a valuable gem. Wow, Horua eventually let out, "That's amazing." But then the little boy realized something. "Wait, so does that mean that you won't be living here anymore?" Nick furrowed his brows. He didn't answer. Nick had often thought about moving out of the dregs, but when it finally became a reality, it felt like it had happened way too soon and quickly. "I guess so," Nick said after a while. Horua became a bit worried, and he looked at the ground. With Nick gone, the gangs would return and he would lose his house. Even more, maybe the gangs would even take revenge on Horua for all the troubles Nick had caused them due to him. Horua was just an 11-year-old boy, and he was very scared of the gangs. Horua felt like he would soon die, but he also knew that Nick actually had no obligation to help him. "And will happen to me?" Horua asked. "What about Dad's house?" Nick sighed. "I don't know about the house, but I can make sure that the gangs won't hurt you. I can probably also store your credits somewhere." Horua's eyes widened in fear. He knew how much everyone coveted his father's money, and after becoming a Zephyx extractor, Nick was suddenly willing to store Horua's money? Horua became suspicious, but he still trusted Nick. After all, Nick had been protecting him for months. For the next couple of minutes, Nick and Horua talked about what to do. In the end, Horua could only sigh and accept that he wasn't strong enough to protect his own money. "If I remain on my own, I will lose my money with certainty. If I trust you, there's still a chance," Horua said. Nick wasn't offended that Horua didn't fully trust him. After all, they were both living in the dregs. "If only there were a way for me to also become a Zephyx extractor and get an ability that makes me powerful." When Nick heard that, he got an idea and he scratched his chin in thought.